Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Space in Africa's webinar series titled Aligning African Space Spending with National Development Goals. My name is Mustafa Iderawumi, a senior analyst at Space in Africa. And today I have my co-host, Samuel Miyagi. He's an analyst at Space in Africa. What we have for you today is a little bit different from what we've been doing for the past couple of months now. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at a very critical aspect of what makes up the African space industry. And this is talking about space budgeting in Africa. So today we'll take you through our key findings from one of our latest reports, which is the 2025 African Space Budget Report. And there we're going to be taking you through three major things: the why, the how, and the what. So with the why, we're going to be telling you why countries keep spending or keep allocating budgets for their space programs. And with the how, we're going to be showing you exactly how they spend those budgets. Once they allocate it to the respective space agencies, how exactly do they allocate this budget within the agency, and what do they spend them on? That will take us to the last one, which is what. So the what is going to tell you guys exactly the key items that this agency spent its budget on. So for these three questions that we want to answer, what we're going to be doing again is just looking into some of the key findings that we've derived from that budget report that I mentioned. So the table of contents today is very straightforward. So the first, I'm just going to take you through the target audience guide, just basically saying who exactly should read this report and why did we actually do this report. Then the next one is going to be talking about the budget aggregate for 2025. Then we are going to be going into some granular details, which is going to be talking about the country level analysis for some select countries. Then we are going to take some more granular details under the other countries and show you what each of the countries are allocating and how. Then the last one is we're going to be telling you some key recommendations on how we think we can enhance space spending through governance tools. So the first part is just the guide that is basically saying why should anyone read this report. So the objective of the report is very clear. In Africa, we know that there are like numbers of countries now that are actively participating in space. And one of the ways that they do this is by getting budgetary allocation from the government. And so the report is basically a tool that is supposed to provide a very clear understanding of government spending on space initiatives and activities across the continent, and also to show the priorities of each government. So on the left, you can see the part that says who is the report for. That is just basically saying the group of people that we had in mind when we were working on this project. So I will just take a couple of them and just tell you why we think they need it and what they would actually gain by reading the report. So the first is the policymakers and also the government officials from different countries, both in Africa and also outside Africa. Why we think it's a good thing for them to get their hands on this report is so that they can gain comprehensive details into how different African nations structure their space budgets and also their space priorities. And what we know they would gain by reading the reports is access to comparative budget data that will help them justify funding requests. So if a country is also looking to get some certain funding from their government, they would have justification from other countries that have done so, which would help them in making their case to their government. We also have space industry executives and also satellite manufacturers. This is very straightforward. Why should they read the report? They want to know what each of these countries' priorities are. Who wants to launch what? What exactly are they looking to launch? So with that information, they will be able to get critical intelligence on which nations allocate significant resources to satellite acquisition. and also some other space infrastructures, like ground stations and all of that. And that would help these companies to target their business development efforts towards those countries that they've highlighted as those that are prioritizing some of these infrastructures. And on the right, just for the sake of time, on the right, you have some of the key questions that we answered in the report. These are some of the questions that we answered. If you want to know how much African governments allocate to their space program annually, if you also want to know which country has the largest budget, if you want to know how many of these emerging African countries actually allocate an annual space budget to their space program, if you also want to know what the percentage of Africa's national budget is earmarked for their space endeavor, that is also something that we did in the report, and some other questions that are here. So firstly, let's look at the budget aggregates, the 2025 space budget aggregate. So, but before we go into these, let me just take a few minutes to talk about the methodologies for this report so that you understand exactly how we came about this data. So there are two major things that we did there. The first one is desktop research. If you're familiar with how budgeting works for Africa or for countries generally, countries release their budgets every year for at least majority of the countries. So what we did was we pick each of the countries, then we do our analysis on it, looking at what has been earmarked for each of the countries in terms of their space program. Then afterwards, we now talk to the space agency heads for each of these countries. Why did we talk to them? Just so we get granular details on why and how, looking at the priorities of the countries and also exactly what they intend to use the allocation for. So on the right, you see a map of Africa, and it shows the allocation to several African countries, 13 in total here that has been analyzed. And then on the far left here map, you can see a budget allocation for the African Union Commission, and also something that we term others. For the AUC and others, we're going to talk about that in details later. But for now, you can see the allocation to 13 African countries for 2025. And the budget estimate aggregates comes up to $426 million. And why is it in dollars? So each of the countries have their budget allocation in their respective local currencies. But for uniformity's sake, we converted all the local currencies into United States dollars using 100 rates. So everything has been converted. So for Egypt, their budget is predominantly in Egyptian pounds. Nigeria is in Nigerian naira. So that is what we did for each of the countries. We converted it to the USD equivalent using the 100 rate, and then we summed up everything. And it comes up to $426 million, which is a slight reduction from what we had in 2024. So if you look on the right, I'm talking about the key takeaways now. It's a slight reduction from the 2024 aggregate. But why is the aggregate like that? So that is one of the insights that you gain from the report. So one of the reasons is because of economic pressures in majority of these countries. You also have inflations and currency devaluations. So when we get to the individual country analysis, that's country level analysis later on, you're going to be seeing how this plays out in some of these countries. But just to give you a very quick example, if you take Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria has been allocating marginal increments in their space budget in the past 5-6 years. But what we see is that even though the allocation in Nigerian naira, which is their current, their local currency, is increasing, the USD conversion is actually decreasing. Why? Because of currency devaluation. In 2023, the 1 naira on average equals to around 500 naira. $1 is around 500 naira on average in 2023. But now in 2025, currently, $1 is around 1,600 naira. So you can see that even though some countries are actually allocating similar funding caps, with previous years, the USD conversion, because of the currency devaluation, is making the value drop. That's one reason. Another reason is because of the shift in the traditional funding model. So right now, we are seeing like a very clear-cut shift from how countries usually allocate their budget in the past and what they are doing now. So for several countries, we see that what they are doing more on their annual budgeting is just to allocate for operational expenses. Then for their small projects, they might also allocate some money to that within their annual budget. But then once you go to small to medium scale infrastructures and also to large scale investment, they have a different budget for this. So this is another chart just to show you the trend of space budgets from 2018 till date. So like I mentioned, you can see the progression. You have increments for a couple of years, and you have the reduction. We started from 2023 to date. So from 2023 to what we have right now, we've seen like majority of the countries now moving away from the traditional model and then going into the new model, which I just explained now. So an example which I've highlighted there just to put some light into this would be Angola. So in the past 3 to 5 years, Angola has been allocating a very moderate budget for their space program. And this allocation has basically just gone into operational expenses, staff and wages and salaries, bonuses, and all of that. But then they've actually worked on several high-level, large-scale projects within that term. Angola has launched their communication satellite, the AngoSat-1, and also the replacement for that, the AngoSat-2, which was launched in August 2023. They also have their mission control center in Rwanda, which can, get information from like 3 to 5 satellites concurrently. And they just signed a new deal in this year in January with Airbus to launch an Earth observation satellite, the Angel-1, for about over 200 million euros. So this just goes to show that even though the allocation to their space program is usually less than 5 million, they have supplementary budgets which caters to their medium to large scale expenses. So we can also take a look at, the budgets in each of these countries as it relates to the total national budget. And you can see the variation for each of the countries that we've highlighted here. But some of the key things that we grabbed from this was that no country, allocates up to 1% of their national budget to space. And this is not far-fetched either. Space is still a relatively young sector for many African countries. And, as many countries get to know about what space can do for them, I believe, and we hope with the trend that we've seen over the past few years, that this is going to increase. So we can also see that some large economies, we can take Nigeria, for instance, can also take South Africa. So they invest more in absolute terms. So absolute terms, just to break it down, means if you have a bigger economy, then that means you have more money that is available to be spent on projects. Then that would now mean that you might have the ability to actually, allocate higher space spending to your space program. And this is what we've seen in some of these countries, especially in Nigeria and then in South Africa. So another one that I want to talk about is African Space Agency budget, which is one of the things that I highlighted earlier in that map that I showed a few slides ago. So for AFSA, African Union Commission, they allocated a budget of 35.4 million for a 5-year implementation period, which started in 2024-2025, and is supposed to end in 2029. And the budget is divided into 3 phases. But for each of the year, we can see what they intend to spend the money on, the brackets, so to say. So you have operational expenses, Then you also have some spending on asset acquisition. Then you also have some spending, the one in green, to programs, different initiatives. So, like I mentioned, the budget to African Space Agency has been divided or structured into three phases. So the first phase is supposed to be between 2024 and the current year, 2025. And it is supposed to be where they will be establishing facilities and offices and also recruiting personnel, just to kickstart the agency operation. And for that, they budgeted the lowest amount for all the three phases, which is about $2.83 million. So the phase two, which is supposed to start next year and run into 2037, is when they intend to expand their operation, start working on programs, start building, start acquiring assets and all of that. And for this, they've earmarked $8.69 million to the second phase. And for the third phase, which is supposed to be between 2028 and one into 2029, they earmarked about 24 million to this. Also, just like I've mentioned with the shift from the traditional funding model to the new one for the countries, this is also something that we are seeing with AFSA's budget, because you can see the funding for the program and for the agency, and you can agree that they are going to be working on a lot of projects whose funding will not be part of this funding that I've just mentioned there. So those are going to be funding for for programs or collaborative projects. An example is the one with the European Commission, the 100 million package for a strategic gateway. That particular funding now is going to be a supplementary project that are going to come as regards different programs that the agency is going to be working on. But for this, which we think would just be majorly for operational expenses and small scale programs and asset acquisition, this is what it will look like from now to 2029. So Samuel, I'll leave you to take the country level analysis.
Thank you, Mustafa, for that overview of the African space budget. So just to give a highlight that in this country level analysis, we focused on a select number of countries. We have not analyzed all of them, but we selected a few for this specific webinar, but all the others can be found in the report. And we will begin with Botswana. Botswana is, of course, an emerging space country that is continuously allocating more to its space program, and its space activities are primarily driven by the Botswana International University of Science and Technology, although the country does not have a dedicated space agency yet. So under its 2025 budget, the country allocated about $4.71 million, and a large chunk of this has been allocated to BOTSAT-1. Now, of course, Botswana already launched its satellite, BOTSAT-1, in March of 2025, but the follow-up activities, including the receiving of the satellite imagery and the upgrading of its ground station to the X-band, will be covered under the supplementary budget for BOTSAT-1. And of course, now that Botswana has also allocated a large chunk of its allocation to astronomy and space science, which underpins its participation in the Square Kilometer Array project. And of course, this will be used to advance radio astronomy capabilities in the country, including developing a radio telescope. Now, consistently over the past few years, we've also seen Botswana allocate some portion of its budget towards satellite data distribution systems, just also to underpin that governments are allocating funds towards how can we use satellite data to advance some of our key government priorities, such as environmental monitoring, natural resource management, land use planning. So towards this, of course, Botswana allocated about $6,500 US for that specific allocation. So we can move on to the next country, which is Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, this fiscal year, which ran from June 2024 to June this year, 2025, has allocated about $12.78 million to advance its space program. And this allocation has been divided into two key focus areas, which is the capital expenditure and the recurrent expenditure. And of course, one trend that we've seen in terms of under its capital expenditure, which sums up to about $7.6 million, the satellite ecosystem in Ethiopia is becoming a key focus area of its capital expenditure, which amounts closely to over 50% of its capital expenditure is driven towards the satellite ecosystem. And an example, of course, is the third point, which is construction, satellite installation, and inspection. We are updated that Ethiopia is working on its second EO satellite, which is ETRSS-2. And part of this budget, will go towards and that process of, acquiring and the requirements of continuing that development process of the satellite, and as well other satellite stakeholders in Ethiopia, such as infrastructure towards satellite development, upgrading of its upgrading of its Entoto ground stations, is also part of the budget under the capital expenditure, which again we've said that the satellite ecosystem is becoming a key focus area in terms of the Ethiopian space budget. Additionally, similar to Botswana, Ethiopia is also investing in astronomy and space science and is looking to upgrade its Entoto observatory, through procurement of advanced telescopes as part of its budget. And of course, as we've seen as a summary of Ethiopia, that primarily a major portion of its space budget has been allocated towards the Space Science and Geospatial Institute, which is the equivalent of its space agency, which helps in the coordination of space-related activities in the country. Again, we've also seen, now moving on to the recurrent expenditure of Ethiopia's space budget, a key highlight that is also observed in other countries is the development of the national spatial data infrastructure, which begs to answer the question, okay, how do we collate all this satellite imagery into one portal, for example, that can be used by various agencies to advance their socio-economic goals? So this as well has been budgeted by Ethiopia under the National Spatial Data Infrastructure Project, over and above allocation to operational expenses such as management and administration. Lastly, under Ethiopia as well, Ethiopia has announced plans to enhance its ground station as a service segment. And of course, as a trend, we expect to see in the near future that funding allocation will also be geared towards advancing its ground station as a service segment. Yes, next country. So the next we'll also have a brief look at Kenya. And Kenya for the financial year 2025 has proposed to allocate about $3.6 million to advance its space program. And a huge portion of this, about 66%, will be allocated towards the National Space Management Office, which the Kenya Space Agency lies under. This, of course, now will be used to operationalize the activities of the Kenya Space Agency as it continues in its role of coordinating the space-related activities in the country. Additionally, about 34% of its budget has been allocated to the Directorate of Resources Survey and Remote Sensing, which is the DRSRS, a government agency that uses satellite technology and satellite imagery to provide data-driven decisions for other government agencies in Kenya, has allocated about 34% of the Kenya space budget. And of course, DRSRS is increasingly participating in space activities, of course, aligning with the Kenya space strategy and policy. And this, of course, was evidenced by its recent MOU signing with Star Vision, just to use how can we use remote sensing and resource mapping capabilities for environmental monitoring. Additionally, just under the Kenya Space Agency, a highlight of its budget as well is that they are developing a data lab, an EO data lab that will be used, through the support of Expertise France, a group in Europe, to be able to develop the EO capabilities in the country. And this, of course, is scheduled to for completion in next year in 2026. Next, we will have a brief look at Namibia and a trend, as you can see in the chart on the left. For Namibia, Namibia has consistently allocated an increase towards its national space budget since its first allocation in 2021, all the way to 4.9 million US dollars in the current financial year 2025. And this primarily has been allocated towards the construction of the satellite data receiving ground station in Windhoek, its capital city, and the funds, the 4.9 million US dollars, has been divided into two in terms of its input. So 78% of the funding has come externally from the Luxembourg government, and 22% has come internally from the government of Namibia towards the construction of its satellite data receiving ground station. And as Mustafa said, this is not all that Namibia does in space. So other funding models have been used, of course, now to advance other activities in the Namibian space program, and of course, other countries as well. Another very interesting case is Nigeria, which is one of the largest space economies in Africa. And as Mustafa mentioned, currency devaluation plays a very huge role in terms of the African space budget. And as we can look to the chart on the left, in 2023, in terms of the USD equivalent, Nigeria allocated about 84 million US dollars, which at that time was equivalent to about 37 billion Nigerian naira. So in 2023, we can see 84 million US dollars, which again is an equivalent of 37 billion naira. But consistently over the years, in about 2 years, that same US dollar allocation in terms of the Nigeria space budget dropped in terms of the US dollar to 61 million US dollars, while increasing in the local currency almost 3 times to about 94 billion US dollars. So this shows that Nigeria is not necessarily spending less on space, is in that, as Mustafa said, the dynamics of these economic factors such as currency devaluation affect the space spending in terms of its equivalent to the dollar, because as we've said, all the countries allocate their budgets in their local currency, but of course for uniformity, we have to convert them to the USD. So this is a case of how, of course, the economic factors play a role in this African space budget. And just to add on to that, it's not that Nigeria spent less, but as Mustafa said, it's actually consistently, by about 21% allocated more or marginally increment to its space program. So next slide. And just as a summary of that 61 million US dollars, Nigeria's space economy is primarily driven by 3 entities, which are the National Space Research and Development Agency, NASDA, with an allocation of 61%. NIGCOMSAT, which is the Nigerian satellite company, which has been allocated about $6 million. And of course, the Defense Space Administration allocated $18 million for the advancement of space technology for defense and security capabilities. Additionally, Nigeria, just as Mustafa has mentioned again, this budget of 61 million US dollars is what has been allocated, but we've seen a shift towards this different model that although 61 has been allocated, governments are looking for alternative funding models towards their projects. For example, of course, the development of various satellites by all the 3 entities in the Nigerian space economy. But also, as Mustafa said, apart from the allocation of under the national space budget, countries like Angola are looking for external funding to facilitate development of small to large-scale infrastructure projects for their space programs. And just as a highlight, in one of the earlier maps of Africa that Mustafa showed you, we had about 13 or 14 countries that were being analyzed. We had the AUC budget and we had the others. So the others is what is represented here for about 42 countries, which their space budgets, have not been entirely disclosed for a few reasons, and we'll talk about them. So out of these 42 countries, we estimate that they contribute about $39.15 million to the African space budget. And of course, this, as a trend observed in other countries as well, is that this $39 million is used for personnel training, development of human capacity development, development of infrastructure such as satellite development, development of astronomical facilities, and also strategic policy initiatives. Because even as countries emerge in the space economy, there will be need for a coordinated framework for developing these space-related activities. So part of their budgets are also allocated towards space policy development. And among the 42 countries, it was also important to note that we divided them into two tiers. So we do have tier one countries, which represent about 13 of them. Examples being Senegal and Gabon and Tanzania, Djibouti, which have very active space programs. But their budgets, as we've mentioned, the methodology at the beginning of this report is that we look at the annual budgets released by their countries. So for these specific tier one countries, yes, they have active space programs, but their budgets ideally have not been disclosed in those national budgets. Lastly, we also have tier two countries, which represent about 29 of them. And these are countries with emerging space activities. So activities here and there that are not necessarily in a well-coordinated manner, but there is some presence of space activities. And those countries, use their budgets for things like, procuring satellite data for academic uses. And as we close off this other country segment, a very important point to note is that we, in the coming up of this $39 million figure, there were some limitations in that the estimation omitted, early stage projects or projects that are still in the conceptual phase, meaning funding has also not been discussed yet publicly. So that was one. And the second limitation of this analysis in terms of the $39 million is that there are projects that are already ongoing, but due to their nature, have not yet been disclosed to the public. And a good example is Somalia and Djibouti. Somalia and Djibouti are developing their spaceport projects in order to advance their launch capabilities. But due to the nature or the secrecy behind such projects, especially because of their alignment towards military capabilities, some of these budgets are not disclosed. So those were the two limitations that came together even as we are doing the analysis of this other country's budget that amounted to about $39.15 million. And I think that will be it from my end. Mustafa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Samuel. So just to reiterate one point that Samuel made, we just picked a couple of countries to analyze just for the interest of time on this webinar. The complete analysis of all the countries that have been summed together to make this analysis can be gotten in the report. So if anybody is looking to get actual details or actual granular insight about any country as regards their priorities or what they're spending on, that is available for anyone that is able to purchase the report. So the next part that we'll be going to is, just the last part, talking about how to enhance space investment through governance tool. And this is a question that governments and also space agencies, especially when they are starting out, have had to answer and then answer again and answer a couple more times again. The question is, for some countries, the question is, you have many people that are, there are like different issues that are going on in the country. There's famine everywhere. There's like climate-related issues that are going on in different countries. So why should a country be spending on space? And for all intents and purposes, we all know that space is a very expensive endeavor. So why should a country be spending on space? Now, the result from the countries that have ventured into space have the answers for new emerging countries to take to their governments and show to them as use cases. So on the right, just to link all these points together, on the right you have like a triangle with the apex being the national impact, and and in the middle you have performance tracking, and at the bottom you have impact-based budgeting. So what is the link between impacts, the budgeting, the budget that is allocated by the government to space program, and how exactly can it be tracked? And what exact impact does that have on the national economy? So the main reason why governments now, or why governments are spending more, and then why we have many other countries that are also emerging in Africa, is because there has been a lot of examples to take from countries that have done similar things that these countries also want to do. So the question is, why should you spend so much on space when people don't have food to eat, when there's like food insecurity in the country, for instance? The result is simple. There is a direct link between data from Earth observation satellites and its applicability and application in agricultural processes, from pre-planting to post-planting operation. That actually sums up the answer to that, with actual cases that you can use as examples to make your points to policymakers and anyone you want to talk to. Another question, okay, so there's war going on in a country, or like there are issues at the border of a particular country and the neighboring countries. Why should a country spend so much on space? The question has already been answered by other countries too. So example is, you can pick Morocco with their V1A and V1B satellites. They are very high-end Earth observation satellites with defense capabilities. There's a clear route between the data from the satellites and what they've been able to do in terms of security and defense purposes for the country. So there are examples now, clear examples of countries in Africa, now not even outside Africa, in Africa, that have spent on space, and then they are regaining value for their money that they've spent. So another example would be, we can pick Angola, for instance. Angola have spent so much money in the past few years. Like I mentioned earlier, they worked on the AngoSat-1, which is their first communication satellite, which failed in orbit, and the replacement was launched into orbit in October 2023 or thereabout. They have also spent on their mission control center in Luanda. They are currently working on their Earth observation satellites with Airbus. So this begs the question, why exactly have they spent on those things? And what exactly are they looking for? So the next slide would answer some of those questions again in a very robust way. So the point is that countries are able to tie their priorities, their national priorities, to their space programs. So if you are looking to improve your agricultural processes, there is a clear route from that to EU data. If what you are looking for is to improve digitization in your country, there is a clear route from satellite communication infrastructure to that. If you're also looking to bridge the digital divide in your country, whether the primary digital divide or the secondary digital divide, there's also a clear route from satellite communication infrastructure to getting that done. If what you are focused on is defense capabilities, examples like I mentioned earlier, Morocco, example like Nigeria, example again, several other examples are there to show how exactly countries can leverage, whether the EU capabilities from satellites or satellite communications, to talking about closed loop communication for defense apparatus and all of that. So the point is that the countries that are able to, request for funding from their governments are able to tie the national priorities of that country to their program. So if the government of the day is very big on agriculture, what you do is you tie your program to programs and initiatives that are going to utilize space-based technologies to improve agricultural processes in the country. Again, so depending on what the priorities of the government is, there are tools, there are satellite-based tools that are able to provide very variable results for whatever it is that the country is looking to get. So that is the last part for the budget analysis there. So just for the sake of anybody that is joining for the first time, again, we just want to talk briefly about Space in Africa and what we do. So we are a boutique consulting, business intelligence, news, and event organization. So we provide data analytics, just like what we did now. We do market research. We also provide consulting, strategic consulting for governments and commercial space actors. Then we organize events like the New Space African Conference that we kickstarted in 2022 in Kenya. We've been running annually, with the last one that held in Cairo in April. And so we produce reports, market reports, just like the budget analysis that we just took you guys through now. We've produced over 16 reports. We've had over 50 consulting engagements with African space actors and also foreign space actors, both on the government side and also on the commercial side of things. So if you are a company and you are looking to set up shop in Africa, and you need to understand the terrain, the landscape of the African space ecosystem, and you want to do feasibility study, you want to do market analysis, you want to understand the players, the competitors, and all of that, you can reach out to us, and that is some of the things that we do at Space in Africa. And this is just a snapshot of some of the companies that we've worked with. You can see on this side, I'm talking about market research. So these are some of the companies that we worked in on that, and consulting and advisory. These are some of the companies and organizations that we've worked with. On the media, event, and networking side, these are some of the companies that we've also worked with. And then we also do space policy assessment for countries, just so your space program aligns with the order of the day. And you can see examples of countries that we worked on: Angola, Rwanda. And so that would be the end of today's webinar. So we will give time for questions. So if there are questions, please let us know. So Samuel and I can take the questions. So we have a couple of questions now. The first one is talking about how do you think Latin America and Caribbean space advancement compares to Africa? For most part, both regions are still emerging space regions. So just the way you have a couple of, for lack of better word, big dogs in Africa. So you can pick like South Africa and some other countries as like the pioneer countries. In Latin America, you can have a substitute for that would be maybe like Brazil with the Brazilian Space Agency. You can also pick Mexico, maybe Argentina. Then what you have are, like smaller players or like emerging countries. So in one word, both regions are still emerging space regions. But if you have like specific questions about them, then maybe we can talk about that. But what are the key needs in terms of space funding in Africa? And how can one get involved into it? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but if the question is saying why should countries fund their space program? If that is the question, then the answer again is like very simple. Funding for programs. So space is not just something that you do just to show that you are also part of the movement. No, it has to be linked to national priorities. So that is the only way that space programs would have any meaningful impact for the citizen, right? So you link the national priorities to what space can do for you. And also you have to realize that it's not everything you want to do that space would be the best answer for it. So that is when you need somebody, or you need a team to help you analyze what exactly it is that you're trying to do in the country, and which of these would be best suited with space-based technologies. But in straightforward terms, you link your national priorities to a particular space program or to the particular space initiative. Then you can then make a case for why you need funding for it. So what has been the balance of foreign funded programs versus internally funded programs? The case of Namibia that Samuel mentioned. So one of the things that Samuel and I mentioned while going through this webinar was the traditional funding methodology, has changed a little bit. And then you also need to understand that for large-scale projects, you can pick any country. The ANGOSAT one was a project between Angola and Russia. The Angio one, again, is now and France, and Airbus, which is in France. So the funding for some of these large-scale projects were as a result of loans, which a country have to pay back as a stipulated time. Another case would be Nigeria's communication satellite, NICOMSAT-1, which failed in orbit, and then the replacement NICOMSAT-1R. Nigeria took a loan from the China Exim Bank. So they used what is called a PBC. It's a purchaser's buyer credit. So they used the credits from that. They now allocated it to an organization in China, which built the satellite for Nigeria. So a common pattern would be that for large-scale projects, governments in Africa usually get loans from different countries. So if you get a loan from a country, usually it comes with some terms, and then you have to repay the loan. But another common trend would be that for many countries, again, China has been trying to, sort of like buy their way into the African scene. So you have countries that are working on projects, joint projects, so to say, that they're working with China. And sometimes they get grants. So these are not loans now, these are grants. They get grants, whether full grants or part funding, to build infrastructures. So in that case, you have two agencies working on the project together. So a case would be for Ethiopia. Ethiopia's ATRSS-1 was a project between Ethiopia and then Chinese counterparts. And then one of the things was, like a grant facility, which paid for parts of the funding for the satellite, while the Ethiopian government also had to pay the remaining part of the satellite. So the dynamics of funding for programs, you have to go in details into each of the countries to understand what works because of the geopolitics at play. But predominantly, the government allocates budgets to these countries for operational expenses, for small scale infrastructures, for medium to large scale infrastructures. But usually for large scale infrastructures, they usually go outside of the country, to get foreign funding, which usually comes as loans that the government have to pay at a stipulated time. Is there any reason why SIA was not on the list? Is there any synergy with nations to collaborate, use test facilities, etc.? Samuel mentioned this while he was going through the individual, like the country level analysis, right? For the purpose of this webinar, we just picked a couple of countries at random. So we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have the full list of all the countries and the breakdown of what each of the dollar that they've been allocated is going into. We have that analysis. So we just picked a couple of countries, and South Africa didn't make the cut, so that's why they're not on the list. But do we have the breakdown for South Africa? Yes. So if you're able to purchase the report, then you can get the granular information about South Africa.
A question here that came with the registration questions. within the agenda, I would be grateful if we could also cover what space industry data sources are considered and agreed as being valid, credible, and trusted. I believe this is in relation to the report. So as Mustafa mentioned in the beginning, the data sources that we use for this specific African Space Budget Report were primarily one from the released annual national budget reports for each country, which are released annually, and of course, insights from the head of the space programs for each specific country. So most of it was through the, those two credible sources. And I hope that question was, of course, aligned with the African space budget. But yeah, so from individual national budgets and from insights one-on-one with the head of the space programs in their specific countries.
Is there any other question that you would like to take, Samuel?
I think that's it. You can take over.
Okay. So like I mentioned, if we're almost out of time, so if you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask, Samuel and I are open to, speaking with anyone. You can connect to us via LinkedIn or via the company's email address, and we'll be happy to pick up the conversation from there. So thank you very much for being a part of this webinar today. We appreciate your presence, and we hope you've been able to learn a couple of things about how space budgeting works in Africa. And like I mentioned, if there are any other questions, we'd be happy to take them. If you also have questions about, how to purchase the report, if you want to do that, then please let us know. Samuel and I or any other person on the team will be able to help you with that. Again, thank you very much for being a part of today's program, and till the next time, say bye.